as you start to stack up these interviews with all these different people, it's really remarkable, mind-blowing to see how their stories differ and how they match up, and sometimes with details that are so specific, it kind of gives you conclusive corroboration that this is a real phenomenon. But after the examination, he got up, he saw his family. They were all sitting in these kind of examination dental chairs. He was very concerned.
Right.
But this gray ET who was standing next to him seemed very kind and said, "No, don't worry. They're just being examined. Everything's fine. Don't worry." And then actually took him to the second level of the craft and up into sort of what appeared to be an observation deck. She says, "Look at the stars, aren't they beautiful?" And he had to agree they were. It was a really gorgeous sight, this just huge field of stars. But definitely experiencers have this weird thing where their what you would call their bioelectric field seems to be a lot stronger than most people. So
really?
They'll go through an enormous number of light bulbs which just explode.
Really?
Yeah, TVs will fuzz up around them, radios, compasses, all kinds of weird electromagnetic effects just from their body alone. So judging from a number of these cases, they can also do all kinds of crazy things with time in terms of time travel and stopping time and extending time and doing all kinds of weird things. There was one study I did of UFOs hovering over mines, like iron mines and gold mines and such. I was shocked. I found like 30 cases. And these are not just sightings.
Yeah.
I mean, they're landing. There's humanoids being seen. They're digging. They're
That's
affecting
incredible.
you. Yeah, it's crazy. So that's an agenda. They're taking our metals. So they act very much like we would if we were visiting another planet and another species.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box. For episode 39, we welcome Preston Dennett to talk about his research into the UFO phenomenon. And as you will soon hear, there are lots of recurrent Spirit Box themes in this field of research too. So Preston Dennett began researching UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends and co-workers were having dramatic unexplained encounters. Since then, he's interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomenon. He's a field investigator for the MUFON UFO Network. He's a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of some 26 books and more than 100 articles about UFOs and the paranormal. In the show, we get into onboard encounters, UFO and alien sightings over mines. Those of you who are fans of the show will immediately get the Hellier connection there. We talk what the aliens want, healing experiences that some experiencers have. We talk about the gifts given by aliens, which is quite a strange one and harks back to an earlier show when we hosted Dana Fox to talk about the language, or indeed the written symbolic language seen on alien craft. In the Plus show, we talk to Men in Black, and we talk about Bigfoot showing up directly after and during sightings. Of course you would, right? And if that sounds like your bag, head on over to the Patreon for the podcast, and there you'll get the extended show and monthly bonus content. Righto, let's get on with the show. Preston Dennett, you're very welcome to the Spirit Box. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on.
Hey, my pleasure. It's an honor.
So I've been going through your archives. I mean, you have a prolific amount of books you've written on the subject of kind of, I guess, the broad UFO phenomenon, and your own work on YouTube. And There's a couple of really interesting things that you've got really into and kind of and pulled together some interesting titles on. Um, and there's two things that really jumped out for me. One is the alien gifts, and the other is the craft interiors. And before we get into them, I wanted to kind of ask you, really, what started your interest in this subject matter as a whole?
Uh, I kind of fell into it accidentally. Certainly wasn't looking for it. I'm very skeptical of UFOs. Growing up, I was just did not believe in anything paranormal. But I was actually a pretty young guy. Let's say it's 1986, so I was 21 years old. Heard a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska, and couldn't believe this pilot was saying he saw a UFO which tracked his plane for about an hour. The newscasters just kind of laughed about it and moved on. But I thought, wow, this pilot, is serious. I thought he was hallucinating, honestly, lying or on drugs or something. But I started asking people, did you hear about this crazy pilot? And found out that a lot of people I knew, people I'd known for years, I mean, family members, friends, coworkers, had had some very dramatic encounters. And by dramatic, I mean my brother chased a UFO down the road with his two friends in his car.
Wow.
And had a sister-in-law. She was with two friends, and they watched these three glowing lights over Van Nuys Air Force Reserve Base. And just kind of snowballed from there. I brought it up at work. Boy, what a mistake. I'm telling you, these people I'd worked with for years were like, oh, yeah, me and my whole family watched this object darting around. And it would hover and dart across the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So it hit home.
Yeah.
And really kind of upset me. Mm-hmm. I was not happy. I was not a happy man.
Mm-hmm. Why did it upset you?
Because I was pretty darn sure UFOs weren't real. Just because I knew how far away the stars are. I was very scientifically minded. And yet, the more I looked into this subject, it was clear it was real. I went to the bookstore and I'm like, I'm going to disprove these guys. I know it's swamp gas. It's got to be. But it wasn't. And I had found that this subject had been taken seriously and studied for decades before I ever, got involved. And that there was a government cover-up. That really shocked me, that this was a very serious subject. So I had to reevaluate everything and really kind of adjust my whole worldview to include the fact that people are being taken on board alien craft and examined and so on. Yeah, not an easy adjustment.
Sure. No, I can imagine. Absolutely. It's like real paradigm shattering subject matter to really kind of delve into, I guess, and to that point, when we first started the conversation about, I was referring to some of the titles that you've written and the book you've done on alien interiors and being taken aboard crafts. It's a remarkable piece. That type of detail into account. So you've clearly done a huge array of research to be able to kind of pick out these kind of, I guess, narrow themes and channels within a kind of an already kind of challenging research area.
Yeah, the UFO field is enormously complex. There's layers and layers to it, and there's mountains of evidence. I've been in this field now for 30, 35 years. And I've certainly interviewed a lot of people, and I've always been kind of most interested in the people who've had direct experiences. Seeing a UFO is, undeniably interesting, I think.
Yeah.
But being, taken on board, here's where we really start to get a lot of information. And as you, start to stack up these interviews with all these different people, it's really remarkable, mind-blowing to see how their stories, differ and how they match up, and sometimes with details that are so specific, it kind of gives you conclusive corroboration that this is a real phenomena. There's just no way people can be making up the same story when they don't know each other. And these are, details that are perhaps not super well known, even today.
Would you be able to take us through some of those details, some of those corroborating pieces?
Yeah, I think when someone's taken on board a UFO, we can pretty much predict to a certain extent what they're going to see. And what's pretty well known is people describe the interiors of UFOs as having a strange lighting system. And by that I mean it's bright inside, but there's no lamps, no lights that they can see, no source of light. So it's really amusing to hear people who've never heard of this try to describe where the light is coming from, because they're mystified about that. And another thing people describe is how there's a central column. This is not perhaps super well known, but this is something I often hear from witnesses, that in the center of these craft is a long central column going from floor to ceiling. Another kind of interesting detail is people describe looking outside the craft, not through your standard window as we would think of it, with a frame and everything. Instead, these objects have a technology where you can look out through a section of the UFO and it just becomes transparent. There's no real edge to the window. And in a number of these cases, the entire craft seems to become completely transparent. So there's no walls that they can see at all, and they're just looking out through empty space. And to hear people say that, because that's not well known, a number of people have said it's like being inside Wonder Woman's jet, invisible. So that's cool. I think that's really interesting. Another interesting detail is people, we know people are taken on board and physically examined. This we hear a lot. Most people will describe this. And some describe being laid out on a table, but just as often people will describe being placed in what looks like a dentist chair, a dental chair.
Right.
So I find that interesting because that's not a detail that's super well known either. So there's all these little sort of red flags, I guess you'd call them.
Right.
Which kind of point to the veracity of someone's account.
And when we have these kind of correlations in terms of like the interior, the specific technologies, are we correlating with specific entities? I mean, is there a variation in entities? I know it seems to be that the prevalent theme is to one of the kind of the gray, but are people talking about different type of entities and the same type of technology, or is there correlations elsewhere there?
It's an interesting question, because it does seem that there are different, we know there are different types of ETs, grays and praying mantis and human looking and all kinds of strange humanoids. And people who've had experiences with grays do describe very narrow benches alongside the wall that are clearly not made for humans, human-sized people, or consoles and small chairs, and everything's very much suited to the size of a 3 to 5 foot being. Whereas people who have had experiences with praying mantis have described that the console that they see is like neck up to their neck, very high. So there's sort of variations in what the interior of a UFO might look like. Generally, they're described as being very sparse in terms of furniture. But as far as technology, that's a difficult question. I don't think people have really been able to match the type of UFO to a certain type of being.
Yeah.
Either, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, given the kind of the memory problems that go along with it, I'm amazed people can kind of retain what detail comes back anyway.
One thing people do agree upon is this technology is far in advance
of
our own, no matter what type.
So one thing that really jumped out at me from listening to your videos is you were talking about a case with a young man called Joe, and they were blackberry picking, and they had an encounter directly kind of from, I think, right beside the blackberry bush. Do you recall that one?
Yeah, Joe Gardner, really
Mm.
neat guy. I'm from Huntington,
Mhm.
West Virginia.
Yeah,
His family has had encounters. As you know, this sort of thing definitely runs in families, and
interesting.
the whole family, all four of them, went out
Mhm.
blackberry picking and had an extraordinary experience. They were just driving down the road and saw what they thought was a house, a
Okay.
very strange looking house because it was saucer shaped and on very tall stilts. And the father kind of jokes and says, look at the spaceship house, kids. You know, look at that." And Joe's just a little boy. He's like, "Wow, look at that. Let's stop, let's stop, let's stop." And he just kept on begging. So they turned around and drove up to this thing, and there was no driveway. There were no wires going off to this thing. It was a couple of 100 yards off in a little field there off the road. And he and his father jumped out and ran up to this thing. And they still thought it was a house. Or Joe reached out and touched one of the landing struts, one of the pillars holding it up, and he could feel cold metal. And his father's like trying to knock on the side of this thing. He's walking around it, can't find any wires or anything to indicate that this is a normal house. He's thinking it's some sort of free energy home or smart home, but this was some time ago. And this is when the door opens, a little ladder comes down, and they're sort of invited on board. It's a long, involved encounter. Uh, his father went up first, Joe followed, and the father didn't seem to notice that this was a very unusual looking figure because little Joe, he shouts out, "Hey, look at the ant man. This guy looks like an ant, a bug."
Wow.
And his father's like, "Don't be rude." So Joe is puzzled. He's like, my dad doesn't seem to realize that this is not even a human being. And so his father's basically being given a tour of the interior of this room and being shown the power source. And again, this is a long, involved encounter. Joe ends up eating this weird kind of wafer and drinking this liquid. It's a very strange experience that some people do have on board UFOs. And this occurred to him and it knocked him out. Next thing he knows, he's being physically examined by these ETs. He got an anal probe that was not pleasant. It was, not a joke to him.
Sure.
But after the examination, he got up. He saw his family. They were all sitting in these kind of examination dental chairs. He was very concerned.
Right.
But this gray ET who was standing next to him seemed very kind and said, "No, don't worry, don't worry. They're just being examined. Everything's fine. Don't worry." And then actually took him to the second level of the craft and up into sort of what appeared to be an observation deck. She says, "Look at the stars. Aren't they beautiful?" And he had to agree they were. It was a really gorgeous sight, this just huge field of stars. So all in all, it was overall a pretty benevolent experience for him. That's pretty much all he really recalls, except suddenly they're dropped back into the car. It's racing down the highway. The father is terrified. He's like, "Those damn things weren't human." They race home, and by the time they get home, it's morning. So they've had hours and hours of missing time.
Wow. Wow, that's really incredible.
Yeah, the mother, I mean, daughter, his sister, the daughter didn't remember anything. They were so tired they just fell asleep on the living room floor.
Mm.
Woke up the next morning very confused about what had happened.
The reason that story really jumped out at me was excuse me, the whole thing around blackberry picking. And there's a real association, a real taboo with berries as a whole and fairies, that actually, like, picking berries in the wrong time of year can actually lead directly to an encounter with that type of being. Um, So yeah, when I was reading that, I was like, whoa, that's really interesting. It's like a kind of very similar kind of crossover in themes. And then that's interesting. You mentioned the kind of the wafer and the strange liquid and kind of the effects of that.
Yeah, his experiences are a little different from most. He's had a lot of very, bizarre paranormal experiences, and some that seem, flat out classic UFO, like that experience, but others which are, much more ghostly or
Oh, really?
involving weird jinns, or, it's
Yeah.
interesting you say the fairy thing, because he's
Mm.
not convinced that this is necessarily extraterrestrial.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, there's, different explanations for UFOs. I'm
Hmm.
pretty convinced at least some or most is
Hmm.
classic, the classic extraterrestrial as we would think of it,
Yeah.
beings from other planets.
Hmm.
But, Jacques Vallée,
Yeah.
Lauren Coleman, number of major researchers feel like this is a phenomena that wears different masks.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
So Joe Gardner is kind of that camp.
Hmm.
Um, and after hearing some of his experiences, I have to agree that does not sound, entirely extraterrestrial.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole thing of following a family line is, is a relatively common theme within both kind of fairy and jinn lore. That's what a banshee is. A banshee is literally a fairy that follows particular families, and as the portent of death. You know, Irish names with Mac and O are generally generally the family lines that particular thing follows. So that I can see where they're getting at that. I mean, I do think there's something there myself. But again, that's kind of one angle on an extremely broad subject range. But yeah, it was interesting to hear that.
Yeah, his case is amazing. He's been able to photograph UFOs on a number of occasions, in front of other people.
Wow.
It's just a series of encounters that's been lifelong, but also includes, ghostly apparitions, which his, girlfriend has also seen, his best friend. They had one instance where there was a UFO hovering over their street, and they pointed a camera at it, and the camera went dead. They pointed it away, and it went live, pointed it back at it, went dead. They did this 3 or 4 times. This UFO was not going to let itself be photographed, and there was nothing wrong with the phone. It would just power down each time they pointed at it.
The whole thing with electronics and just broadly like paranormal and phenomena as a whole seems to be again a consistent theme throughout. That you have the same thing all the time with I mean, even doing these kind of podcasts, like technological issue. I often have guests come on and go, just going to let you know, there's probably will be some issues when we talk about this subject. And lo and behold, like you have just conversations, computers just go dead, that kind of stuff. I've even had kind of my own for my own photographic work. I photographed a story on the gin in Delhi, and yeah, camera broke 2 weeks before going. Just there's always kind of a lot of kind of unfortunately timed electronic failures, I think, when you're in this kind of territory.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear that the minute they point the camera at something, it just goes out. That's crazy.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the UFOs are emitting some kind of beam or
Hmm.
something,
Hmm.
but definitely experiencers have this weird thing where I guess they're what you would call their bioelectric field
Hmm.
seems to be a lot stronger than most people.
Oh,
So
really?
they'll have they'll go through an enormous number of light bulbs which just explode, or
Really?
yeah, TVs will fuzz up around them, radios, um, compasses, all kinds of weird electromagnetic effects just from their body alone. So a lot of problems with computers, and anything electronic can be definitely a problem.
That's really interesting. It's an expensive it's an expensive issue. What was it? Pardon me. What was I going to say? So in terms of that, I mean, like in terms of how you view things, I mean, I get the feeling that you're kind of like, well, I maybe some are kind of a more paranormal phenomenon like Jacques Vallée describes, or maybe some are kind of more nuts and bolts? Where do you lie in it?
Well, I initially came in pretty convinced that this was entirely extraterrestrial, but came to realize that the UFO umbrella is a wide one, and that there's kind of a mixing of genres or phenomena. And I'm very reluctant to, put them all under the same label, because there are researchers out there who say, any type of ghost, any UFO, all of this is demonic. No, definitely not. It's not all angelic either. This is not near-death experiences, or all these phenomena are separate for sure. Having looked into all of these really in detail as much as I can, Bigfoot is different. Near-death experiences are different. Out-of-body experiences, and astral projection, sleep paralysis, a haunting, demons, angels, fairies. These are all separate and distinct phenomena, which often get labeled under the UFO umbrella. I'm sure there are trickster spirits out there who can take on all kinds of shape-shifting forms and a wide variety of interdimensional beings. Time travelers, perhaps. But I'm convinced the extraterrestrial hypothesis is the one that best fits the evidence. I really am, and I think that's, when we talk about UFOs, that's what I mean. And the reason I say that is because if you just look at the evidence objectively, from landing traces to implant evidence to the crash retrieval reports, where we have allegedly obtained these craft and have ET bodies, it's pretty clear what we're dealing with here, for the most part. So I know there are parallels between near-death experiences and UFO abductions, but they're not the same thing. There's definitely a spiritual aspect to UFO encounters, for sure. I think ETs do have the ability to travel interdimensionally, and judging from a number of these cases, they can also do all kinds of crazy things with time, in terms of time travel and stopping time and extending time, and doing all kinds of weird things. So it's very hard to sort of pin this down. So that's why I've kind of looked at everything. I've studied demonology, and I'm convinced there are inhuman spirits out there and very nasty hauntings. I've talked to people who went through this, investigated a bunch of ghosts. I did a bunch of ghost hunting, and I looked into the fairy lore, and I was going in very skeptical and came out shaking my head like, wow, I mean, there's no way you can deny that there was something going on there. But I'm not convinced fairies were aliens or aliens are fairies. I feel like they were a separate phenomena.
And to that end, and please take this question with a pinch of salt, because I know it's an impossible one to answer, but it's where do you feel, or where have you gotten to with, well, what are, if these things are exterior and they're coming to us for whatever reason that might be, like, I guess, what do we know from the interviews that you've had with experiencers and abductees? What are the motivations of these beings?
Yeah, I think we know. I think we've got a really good handle on it, honestly. They have various agendas. Probably the strongest one is, they're physically examining us. They're taking our genetic material, and they are creating hybrid babies. I talk mostly about the grays here, which is a pretty broad spectrum. But I was getting cases from the very beginning. 1988, I was getting cases. This was well before this was, being more widely reported, this hybrid baby phenomena. That's definitely an agenda. And the reason why is because the grays apparently have lost the ability to reproduce, have gotten genetically damaged in some capacity, and are trying to sort of revitalize their race, reintroduce more emotions. This is something we hear from multiple independent, experiencers who do not know each other. That's a strong agenda. There are many agendas. Another agenda, I think, is to sort of save our planet. And the reason I say that is because the single most common message people get, and I hear this over and over again, this is in most cases, well over 50% of onboard cases, people are given some kind of warning, some kind of prophecy, some kind of message, usually pertaining to nuclear proliferation, environmental destruction, whether it's pollution or global warming, destruction of the ozone layer, something along those lines. Lots of warnings about hurricanes and earthquakes and natural disasters, perhaps social collapse or political upheavals. They warn about our overly aggressive ways and our warlike ways. That comes up a lot. So they're very concerned about our planet and our own spiritual evolution, I guess you would say. That's a major agenda. Another, this is really interesting too. This happens 25% of the time. In one of my latest books, Onboard UFO Encounters, I think there was 5 people who had this experience. They were taken to the engine room and shown how the craft works. They just flat out lay it out. Say, we use electromagnetics, or usually it's some variation of that. And in some cases, they'll actually put the person down in the seat and let them drive the craft. That happened in like 3 or 4 of the cases. And they explain exactly how it works and tell people we don't need to use fossil fuels and that there are other sources of energy. So they seem to really want to be waking people up. And thirdly, I would say a really strong agenda is to impart spiritual information of some kind. And the reason I say that is because people come away from these experiences, particularly people who've had onboard experiences repeatedly, they are spiritually transformed. They become very interested in healing. That's very common. Reiki, hands-on healing, this sort of thing. But really a wide variety of this kind of stuff. Channeling, that's pretty common. Psychic reading, water dowsing, astral travel, out-of-body experiences, past lives, environmentalism. They start doing a lot of vegetarianism. That's very common. A lot of alternative sort of new agey type stuff is very common. So I think the ETs want to wake us up to our own potential, honestly, of psychic powers. They seem to be very, very interested in people who have psychic experiences. So yeah, various agendas. I mean, there was one study I did of UFOs hovering over mines, like iron mines and gold mines and such. I was shocked. I found like 30 cases. And these are not just sightings.
Yeah.
I mean, they're landing. There's humanoids being seen. They're digging. They're
That's
affecting
incredible.
you. Yeah, it's crazy. So that's an agenda. They're taking our metals. So they act very much like we would if we were visiting another planet and another species.
Well, there's so much kind of just rich themes to look at there. I mean, the first one, like, I guess, kind of from my perspective, the first one around the idea of the kind of genetic material and they're in some way genetically depleted, or the gathering of genetic material, like that directly correlates with a lot of the stuff around kind of like fairies and changelings, and the reason they swap babies with humans is because their own kind of milk has no nourishment and that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting correlation there. But the
wow, yeah,
like the stuff as well around excuse me, like the healing and coming back, I guess, with gifts or understanding in certain areas where they may not have had that before. I mean, that kind of transformative effect that the experiences seem to have is really interesting, and certainly there's a lot of correlation with people who have said to have had experience with kind of the other, which is broadly call it the other, or whatever that is in terms of like jinn or fairy and those particular type of entities, that inspiration is certainly a thing, like poetic inspiration, creative inspiration.
Yeah, the
You know,
time anomalies as well. That kind
yeah,
of ties together as well.
yeah,
Because I've got
yeah,
cases where people say they're being abducted and time stops. Everyone around them is not moving, but they can move as these grays come up and take them. So it's very strange that grays have the ability to pull people right out of time. And I know there's time anomalies in the fairy stories as well. So you have to wonder, because there's perhaps some of those were ETs.
perhaps. Yeah, perhaps there's something there. But I like what you're saying about these are different things. And I think it's important to keep that um, open mind. Kind of like there is no kind of overarching kind of absolute definition of what's happening. That would be remarkable if there was. That there's an awful lot happening that we can't explain, and that kind of there isn't a one size fits all. Even within themselves, jinn, fairy, alien are total catch-all terms by their definition, right?
Yeah, there's a weird cultural sort of influence on this phenomena. So we do seem to have more grays here in the United States, whereas in South America they have short little humanoids, and in Europe it's more your sort of human-looking ETs. There's quite a bit of bleed through with this, but if you go back, like you say, 100 years in the fairy accounts, and there's all kinds of religious accounts, and I wonder if a lot of this stuff would have been interpreted differently if it happened today. But looking into the fairy lore, I was like, wow, these are not ETs as we would think of them. It's very strange, but it's some incredible parallels.
It really is, and that's really interesting to hear that they're kind of different in different areas of the globe. That's kind of remarkable. And I mean, in the cases that you've researched on in rather, are those kind of aliens, are they doing the similar things to kind of what we would kind of perceive as being I guess the central kind of gray phenomenon and the themes that you just described earlier? Are these entities that are more prolific in South America and Europe, are they doing similar things to the grays? Is the behavior similar?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, people's experiences do follow the general pattern of being taken, physically examined, and let go. That's sort of your core experience. And the messages, as I was telling you about, like environmentalism and warnings, that's universal. We see that everywhere. And that doesn't even seem to track the type of ET. We get that from grays, we get that from human-looking ETs, from praying mantis, from all kinds. There is some variations for sure. I know in Brazil, there were some very scary hostile cases where these entities were not friendly. And there was a number of cases where people had actually died and been killed as a result of being struck by a beam of light from these UFOs. So there was quite a few cases coming down from down there, which we have a few here in the US, but certainly not like that. The cultural variations are very interesting. Back in the 1890s and 1900s, there was a wave of airship sightings, which were very much like dirigibles, with even little propellers and gondolas.
It's incredible. Yeah.
And people have tried to match that up to your modern day flying saucer. And yeah, of all the I guess variations in this phenomena, the airship wave is definitely one of the biggest head scratchers for me, because I don't know what we're dealing with there. If it's people have also raised the possibility that some of this is a breakaway human civilization.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Nazis
Yeah.
who are living in the Arctic. So there's all kinds of possible things going on that might be interpreted as UFOs.
Sure.
Our own government is finding this stuff around.
Sure.
So some of these UFOs we're seeing, people could land and be wearing these blue jumpsuits and they're beautiful and we're going to think they're aliens. No, that's just some guy from the Air Force. So we have to be really careful.
Yeah, it's there's so many layers to this. It's incredible. Um, the, I guess one thing, I haven't looked at so many um experiences and interviewed so many people in your research. I'm sure there's a few that are really, really left you stunned, or just kind of the most amazing ones you've ever heard. And just I'm just curious, what would have been like the standout experiences for you?
Oh gosh, that is such a hard question because they all kind
I'm
of
sorry, it's a dreadful question.
uh, but yeah, certainly there are, standout cases. Um, gosh, it's just all these cases are just swarming through my mind right now. Uh, there's a lot of ones that are very unusual. Um, going back to Joe's case, who was picking blackberries. He had an experience at age 13, which I found remarkable because it matches up some others that I've heard, where it was a very friendly experience. He heard his name being called in his head one evening. It's just a kid, a 13-year-old. And he wakes up and looks around the room. He shares a room with his sister, and it's not her. She's asleep. And it keeps calling his name. And he tries to shake her awake. She won't wake up. This is something we see a lot. And finally, he looks out the window and he sees a figure across the street standing next to a saucer, and it's waving for him to come across the street. So, he's just dressed in his pajamas and leaves the house and creeps across the street and is invited on board this craft. This is a human looking ET, presumably an ET. He can't see anything except that the sky is white. Joe is black. And all he can see on this guy is, his little section of his eyes. Otherwise, it's completely covered in a full body jumpsuit. And can see actually his mouth as well, because you can see the guy is smiling. And this guy invites him on board the UFO and puts him in the seat and takes him actually on a tour to Saturn, shows him Saturn.
Wow.
And tells him, do you know what planet this is? And Joe's like, yeah, that's Saturn. I learned that in school. And I love to hear this because this is something I've heard from in other cases. There's a very famous researcher, Leo Sprinkle, I think it is, who had the same darn experience when he was a kid. And I've heard this from other people I've interviewed. So it's actually being taken to Saturn or another planet, perhaps, or a tour to the moon, even. So he described this, and then the being actually let him pilot the craft himself. And as a little kid, he's zooming it around. He's got this little lever like a joystick. And it was just a very friendly experience. And he got set back down and crawled back into bed and woke up the next morning. He says he could still feel what that joystick felt like in his hand for weeks and was super excited about it. He'd tell everyone, they all thought it was crazy. And just a really neat experience. But yeah, there are some very bizarre ones. Probably one of the more bizarre ones was this lady I interviewed from Nebraska. And she was super excited to talk to me because she wanted to know if anyone had ever seen an ET like the one she described. And no, I have never heard of anything like what she described. She had this very unusual experience. She had gotten very sick from hypoglycemia or something like this, some blood sugar problem, and was losing weight rapidly, having trouble staying conscious after eating, just some really weird blood sugar problems, which the doctors couldn't diagnose. And it was during this time that she was spontaneously and without warning, as she was walking across her living room, she was taken into what appears to be an underground base. She says it was huge, like a giant auditorium. It had indirect lighting, but sort of industrial carpeting. There was a long corridor in the center, and she was in this cubicle, like an office cubicle, laying on a table, pretty much fully conscious, but sedated. And she was having trouble sort of orienting herself because she had just been in her living room. She can see there are hundreds of cubicles. Other people are laying on these tables inside each of these cubicles. She's like, where the heck am I? And she's kind of peering down this corridor when she sees this figure striding towards her. And she freaks out and starts screaming because this thing is about 8, maybe 9 feet tall. And it's not human. It looks basically humanoid, but it's wearing dark, shiny, kind of jumpsuit like clothes and has this huge, huge, broad face. Its head is way too big. Its eyes are very strange. It's got a giant, giant chin. It's not human. And it's got not even hair, but orange, like straw like hair sticking straight up about 2 inches.
Wow.
And a weird kind of black cape. It strides right up towards her and says, "Okay, it's your turn, Jill." And so she's just screaming in terror now. And it wraps this sort of cape around her and sticks these silver instruments on her body, like on her pancreas and various places, which start pulsing energy into her. So it was kind of not painful, but definitely uncomfortable. And she was, terrified she was going to die because she had no idea where she was. And there was this monstrous being over her. And it just became too much for her. She passed out and woke up, and she's back in her living room. And she rushes to her husband to wake him up, and he won't wake up. She has 2 children. She goes to each of them and tries to wake them up. They will not wake up. She's shaking them, shaking them. Takes about a half an hour for her to wake up her family. And she tells them what happened, and they're very supportive. Lucky for her, because that doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. But what's really interesting, I mean, that was a weird experience. But following that, in the days that followed, she started gaining weight again. She stopped passing out after she ate. Her blood sugar problem completely vanished. She was very sore for about a week, but it healed her. She says, "This absolutely healed me." She says, "I have no idea why. I'm just a housewife. My whole husband's nobody special. He's not in the military. We're just, average working class family."
That's really interesting to hear, the whole kind of the healing thing, because that, I guess one of the common motifs about people who have abductions is that, like, they have actual kind of physical damage, that you hear a lot more, and maybe that's just one of those things that have just captured the public imagination, that but some people kind of develop health problems after abduction. So it's interesting to hear that there's a complete reverse of that.
Yeah, physiological effects are very interesting. In fact, the MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, if you become a field investigator, there's a whole section in the manual on medical effects, but they call it medical injuries. They do not mention healings. There has been definitely a sort of bias towards injuries as opposed to healing effects, is what I found. And yes, people do suffer medically. There's a lot of women who have gynecological problems. And there's a certain percentage of people who do seem to suffer strange illnesses following an encounter. Severe infections, perhaps, pain, cuts, bruises, certainly, all kinds of scoop marks, perhaps even cancer in some cases. But looking into it, I would say some sort of eye damage, sort of like looking into a welder's arc, or eye irritation. That's very common. But I've documented more than 300 cases of people who've been healed, physically healed, of a wide variety of not only injuries and, broken bones, bruises, burns, things like that, but minor illnesses like flus and colds and stomach aches and things like that, to very severe illnesses, such as perhaps jaundice or diphtheria or tuberculosis or hepatitis or, boy, you name it, leukemia, tumors. And there's 30 some cases of people who've been healed of cancer, chronic cancer in some cases. So really a very, very wide variety and quite a bit of really solid evidence that there is, in fact, a really benevolent side to these guys. In fact, that is one of their major agendas, I'm convinced, is healing people.
Incredible stuff. Well, I'm conscious that we're just on the hour. Preston, really, really grateful for your time. Some hugely interesting, just hugely interesting subject matter, and thank you again for coming in to share your fantastic research. I will leave the links to both your website and your YouTube channel in the show notes. Is there anywhere else where people would like to reach out to you? Are you on our social media, or have you wisely left that world alone?
No, it's got me snared. Yeah, Facebook and a little bit of Twitter. I'm just learning how to tweet. So having a little bit of fun with that. Mostly YouTube is where I'm concentrating my energies, and putting out new books and articles in various magazines. So you can see my stuff there as well. But yeah, I think this is an important subject. It's going to change the world. It's going to be a very, very different world, I think. This is certainly what the experiencers are being told. Lots of changes ahead.
Oh, God, you see, DC, I have to say something really interesting just as we're coming towards the end of the interview. So when we talk changes ahead, what do we mean?
Yeah, this is a very strong theme among experiencers. The ETs are hinting towards open official contact.
Wow.
They're hinting towards, some real fundamental changes in our reality in terms of paranormal phenomena, perhaps like moving up a vibrational level,
right,
or into the fifth dimension, or new waves of cosmic energy, or very sort of ethereal explanations, but all sort of the same theme of perhaps the veil between the worlds becoming more thin.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what that means, but it certainly would explain why we're having this sort of explosion of weird cryptozoological creatures and all kinds of interdimensional beings and weird stuff. So perhaps that's it, but also disclosure as well.
Yeah.
ETs are very much pushing that, I think. I think we're going to see that, and we're going to see all kinds of technologies.
Yeah.
So yeah, possible real problems with natural disasters. So definitely, it's exciting times ahead either way.
Yes, definitely. Well, again, I appreciate your time, and I will stop dragging the interview on. So, thank you again for your time. It's been great talking to you, and hopefully talk soon.
Yeah, thanks very much. I had a blast.
Well, there you have it, chaps. I hope you enjoyed that. Be sure to check out Preston's links in the show notes and give him a follow. It's always good to support our researchers out there, people doing independent research. I think it can be a tough, isolating thing doing by yourself. So do give a bit of support there. Right, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed the show. Talk soon.